I represented myself in court. My dad laughed so loudly the bailiff glanced over. "You're too poor to hire a lawyer," he said, shaking his head in front of everyone. People in the gallery chuckled. Even the opposing attorneys smirked with that condescending country club confidence I knew too well. But when I stood up, opened my binder and spoke my very first sentence, the entire courtroom froze. Not metaphorically, not symbolically, froze. As in, people stopped shifting, stopped whispering, even stopped breathing for a second, like someone had cut the audio out of the world. And for the first time in my life, my father looked at me not with disappointment, not with annoyance, but with something closer to fear, or respect, or both. That moment didn't come out of nowhere. It came after decades of being the second choice, the backup plan, the kid who was fine, I guess, while my younger brother Clay was the real future of the family. It came after years of being told I wasn't smart enough, pretty enough, confident enough, or clever enough to do anything that required brains. But before I get to that frozen courtroom, I need to tell you how we got there, because none of it happened the way people assume. I grew up in a small Midwestern town where your worth was measured by two things: how many people recognized your last name, and how much land your family owned. My dad, Frank, was proud of both. He had the sort of handshake that crushed your knuckles, and the sort of laugh that filled a room, usually because he was making fun of someone smaller than he was. Most of my childhood memories of him involve him pointing at me and laughing, not in a sweet, playful dad way, but in a dismissive way, like he was already tired of the person I'd someday become. Clay, on the other hand, could do no wrong. If he got a B-, Dad celebrated like he'd won a state championship. If I got an A, Dad said, "Well, let's see if you can do it twice before we brag." When Clay wanted to try baseball, Dad bought top-of-the-line gear. When I wanted to join the swim team, Dad said, "Why no one comes to watch girls swim?" By the time I graduated high school, I knew two things with absolute clarity. If I stayed home, I'd spend the rest of my life waiting for Dad to see me. I'd rather disappear completely than keep begging for his approval. So I joined the Navy at 19. I didn't do it for patriotism, not at first. I did it because it was the only escape hatch I had. And once I was in, once I tasted a life where discipline mattered more than last names, where hard work outweighed family politics, I discovered I was actually good at something. Really good. People listened when I spoke. Supervisors trusted me with classified work. I found out that the brain my dad assumed was average at best could process complex information, organize patterns, and catch inconsistencies like a hawk spotting mice in the field. I built a career in Navy intelligence, quiet, meticulous, respected work. Dad never cared. Whenever I came home on leave, he grunted, "Hello," asked why I wasn't doing something meaningful, and then spent the rest of the night bragging about Clay's latest business scheme, which inevitably involved him borrowing money he never paid back. Mom tried to defend me, but she passed when I was 26, and after that there was no buffer between Dad's sharp tongue and my quiet endurance. I sent money home for repairs on Mom's house, the house she'd inherited from her parents. I thought it was the right thing to do. Clay and Dad never thanked me. They didn't even acknowledge it. But I kept going, kept serving, kept imagining one day Dad might say, "I'm proud of you, kid." That moment never came. The year everything unraveled, I was stationed in Virginia. I got a voicemail from my Aunt Denise saying she'd heard a rumor Dad and Clay were planning to sell Mom's house. Not rent it, not fix it, sell it. And according to Denise, they were transferring the deed to Clay alone. I drove 10 hours home without stopping. When I asked Dad about it, he didn't even try to hide it. "It's our decision," he said. "Clay needs the money. You're off doing Navy stuff, you don't need a house." It was Mom's, I reminded him. She wanted it split evenly. Dad waved me off. "You weren't around. Clay helped take care of things." That was a lie, a big one. Clay hadn't helped take care of anything. He'd trashed the place, held late-night parties, and left Mom to cry in her bedroom while Dad pretended not to hear. I told Dad I wasn't signing anything. He laughed loud like it was the funniest thing he'd ever heard. "You think you have a say," he scoffed. "You can't afford a lawyer, and you sure can't fight us on your own." Something inside me snapped, not in anger, but in clarity. The same clarity I feel when I analyze threat reports or intercept patterns. The clarity that tells me there's something here, and I can figure it out. So while Dad and Clay forged ahead with their plan, I went to the courthouse, asked for public records, read everything I could find, and realized they were violating at least 2 state statutes. The will had legal standing. The deed transfer had glaring flaws. I filed an injunction, on my own, paid the small fee, submitted the evidence. Dad found out and exploded. "You're humiliating this family you representing yourself? Don't be stupid." But I wasn't stupid, not then, not ever. The morning of the hearing, I walked into the courthouse alone. Dad and Clay strutted in with their attorney, a man with a polished tie, and the kind of smile lawyers wear when they think the fight is already over. When the judge called my name and asked if I was representing myself, Dad leaned back and laughed. "She's too poor to hire a lawyer, Your Honor," he announced. People actually nodded, agreed, dismissed me in an instant. And then I opened my binder. I stood, I spoke. And the courtroom froze. When the courtroom fell silent after my first sentence, I saw something flicker across Dad's face. Confusion, maybe even concern, but neither he nor Clay understood what was actually happening. Not yet. They still believed they held every card in the deck. They thought I was just stalling, pretending to sound smart before the judge inevitably shut me down. They thought they knew me. They thought they knew everything. They were wrong. To understand what they believed that morning, you'd have to understand the roles each of us had played in my family for years. Dad, the unquestioned authority, Clay, the golden son, and me, the forgettable one, the temporary one, the one who served in the Navy, because in his words, you weren't cut out for anything else. When Mom passed, Dad changed in ways I didn't fully see until later. He hardened. He clung to Clay like Clay was the last piece of a future he could control. He treated me like a guest sometimes, even like a stranger. Sure, I came home when I could. Navy schedules were unpredictable, and intelligence work doesn't exactly leave much flexibility, but I still visited. I still checked in on them. I still sent money, a lot of money, whenever Dad said something needed fixing. The roof, the heater, the water pump, the front deck that was rotting. I didn't ask for receipts. I didn't ask if Clay helped. I just did it because that was the kind of daughter Mom raised me to be. But to Dad, none of that mattered. What mattered was proximity. Clay lived 5 miles away. I lived 5 states away. Therefore, Clay was loyal. I was absent. End of story. So when the idea of selling Mom's house came up, Dad naturally turned to Clay. Not to talk, not to discuss, but to decide. When I objected, he treated me like I was interrupting a conversation adults were having. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be," he told me. "Clay is the one who's been here." Since when I'd asked, and he'd glared at me like I'd cursed in church. So yes, by the time we reached that courtroom, Dad already had a script in his head. Clay, the responsible one saving the family. Me, the disruptive one causing chaos because I didn't understand real life. And when I walked in without an attorney, the script seemed confirmed. I could practically hear the internal monologue running in Dad's mind as I started speaking. "She's going to embarrass herself. She always overestimates her abilities. The judge will shut her down any second now." But the judge didn't shut me down. He listened. He actually listened. I began with a simple statement of fact one the opposing attorney had conveniently overlooked in his pre-hearing brief. Something small, technical, buried in a subsection of a statute no one bothers reading unless they work in compliance or have too much time on their hands. But I had both discipline and time. After that moment of sudden silence, the attorney tried to recover. "Your Honor," he said, clearing his throat, "this is being presented out of context. We believe—" The judge held up a hand. "I'd like to hear her finish." You could feel the tension shift in the room, tiny but unmistakable. The way people adjusted in their seats, the way Clay leaned forward, brows pulling together. Even Dad's smirk faltered for a heartbeat. Not enough for him to truly doubt himself, of course. Just enough for him to wonder whether he'd missed something. But Dad had no idea what had led to this moment. No one did. For weeks before the hearing, while he and Clay laughed about how the Navy girl thinks she's Matlock, I was spending every free hour learning everything I could about property law, probate deed transfers, and handwritten wills. Not because I thought I was smarter than attorneys, no, but because I knew I could outwork Clay, outfocus Dad, and outprepare anyone who underestimated me. I went to the local law library on base, watched videos of real hearings, printed copies of state statutes, and highlighted them until the pages looked like a neon art project. I asked one of my fellow Intel analysts, a guy who once considered law school, for help understanding certain phrasing. I read case summaries until my head ached. And every time I hit something confusing, something dense, something that made me want to throw the whole binder across the room, I remembered Dad saying, "You can't win. You don't have the brains for this." It became fuel, lifelong fuel. So by the time we arrived in court, I wasn't just winging it. I had a strategy, I had documents, I had receipts, I had the truth. But Dad didn't know that. And honestly, he didn't want to know. Because admitting I could do something independently, something difficult, would mean admitting he'd misjudged me my entire life. And that was something Dad wasn't emotionally equipped to do. When the judge asked the opposing attorney to let me proceed, the man forced a smile and stepped back, but I could see the concern. Lawyers know when they've overlooked something. They know when a thread is being pulled. I continued calmly, methodically referencing dates, signatures, and inconsistencies with the kind of precision intelligence work demands. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't grandstand. I simply laid out the facts the way I'd learned to brief commanding officers, clear, concise, and impossible to deny. Dad leaned toward Clay, whispering harshly. Clay whispered back. They looked nervous. It was the first time I'd ever seen them look unsure about anything involving me. But here's the thing. It wasn't just fear on their faces. There was something else underneath it. Recognition. The dawning realization that I wasn't who they thought I were, that maybe I never had been. And for a moment, just a flicker, I felt something I had spent decades craving. Power, not over them, but over my own story. I wasn't the weak one. I wasn't the lesser one. I wasn't the invisible daughter who never quite measured up. I was a Navy intelligence analyst who knew how to read, how to prepare, how to think, and how to fight back without ever raising my voice. And they were only beginning to understand that. Most people think courtroom victories happen in the room itself, during the speeches, the objections, the dramatic pauses. But that's not true. Courtroom victories are won in the quiet hours no one sees, the nights when everyone else has gone to sleep, the mornings when you're up before dawn reading something so dense it feels like the words are fighting you, the long determined hours when you keep pushing simply because giving up would mean proving your critics right. And if there's one thing I refused to do, it was prove my father right. The truth is, the moment Aunt Denise called me about the house, I already knew I was on my own. Dad was too stubborn, Clay too opportunistic, and the whole situation too unfair for me to rely on anyone else. I knew I needed to prepare, and I knew the preparation would be brutal. Still, the military gives you an odd kind of confidence, the belief that if you just work hard enough, long enough, and consistently enough, you can survive almost anything. So I turned my dining table into a war room. I pushed back the chairs, cleared the surface, and set up piles of documents, each divided by colored tabs: yellow for statutes, blue for deeds, pink for correspondence, green for case summaries. It wasn't pretty, but it was functional. During the day, I worked my regular Navy intel shift. At night, I lived in two worlds, one governed by classified information, the other by property law. I'd finish a 10-hour shift analyzing patterns, threats, and reports, then go home and switch gears to analyze legal frameworks, precedents, and loopholes. Sometimes my head felt like it was splitting open. Sometimes I questioned why I was doing this. Sometimes I wanted to scream that none of this should have been necessary. But every time doubt crept in, I'd hear Dad's voice, "You can't win. You're not cut out for this." And that was enough to keep me going. My first big discovery came through sheer exhaustion. I'd spent 3 nights rereading Mom's handwritten will, looking for inconsistencies or weaknesses the opposing attorney might exploit. Instead, I found something else, a clause referencing State Statute 42B, something the attorney should have caught but didn't. That discovery changed everything. I realized the whole case hinged on a few key elements. Whether Mom's handwritten will held legal weight. Whether Dad and Clay's deed transfer constituted an unlawful attempt to bypass that will. Whether Clay had any legitimate claim to the property at all. So I built binders plural. One for the timeline, one for legal conflicts, one for financial motives, one for Dad's signature inconsistencies, because yes, I went there. Every binder had tabs, labels, notes, cross-references. It looked less like legal prep and more like an intelligence briefing for a high-ranking admiral, which, in hindsight, was fitting because that's exactly how my mind works. One night around 3 in the morning, I was reviewing a case summary involving a disputed farmhouse in Iowa. The situation wasn't identical to ours, but it shared the same issue. A family member tried to override a handwritten will by transferring the deed before the estate settled. The court ruled the transfer invalid. I stared at the page for a long time, my heart pounding. This was it. This was the pattern. This was the thread I could pull. But I needed more, something solid, something irrefutable. So I drove to the county clerk's office on my next day off and asked to see every document related to the house going back 16 years. The clerk raised an eyebrow, clearly wondering why a Navy intelligence analyst cared so much about old property records. I didn't explain. I just waited as she brought out box after box. In those documents, I found the second crack in their armor. Dad had signed paperwork the same week he'd told me the roof repairs could wait. His signature on that document didn't match the one on Mom's will acknowledgement. It wasn't forgery, not exactly. It was more subtle, sloppy, rushed, legally questionable. I photographed everything, documented everything, built a timeline down to the day. When I put all the pieces together, I realized something that shook me. Clay's involvement wasn't just opportunistic, it was strategic. He needed the house because he was drowning in debt. Selling it would give him the cash to bail himself out. And Dad was enabling him. Not because he hated me, not because he wanted to hurt me, but because he believed Clay needed saving and that I'd be fine. I'd survived deployments, I'd lived overseas, I had a steady job. Clay didn't. Dad wasn't trying to punish me, he was sacrificing me. That realization hit harder than I expected. But understanding his motive didn't change what I had to do, so I kept preparing, kept working, kept pushing. At one point, one of my fellow analysts, Petty Officer Ramirez, noticed I was exhausted and asked what was going on. I didn't give details, but I mentioned I was studying property law. His eyebrows shot up. Property law, that stuff is a nightmare. I laughed. Tell me about it. He hesitated, then offered something that surprised me. I almost went to law school. If you need help understanding any of it, I'm around. I don't think he expected me to take him up on that, but I did, and he helped me decipher dozens of complicated paragraphs that would have taken me hours to untangle alone. Of course he didn't know the whole story. No one did. I was afraid if I told anyone they'd say what Dad always said, you're overreacting. You're making a fuss. Let it go. But I couldn't let it go, not this time. Because letting it go meant erasing my mother's wishes. Letting it go meant rewarding Clay's scheming. Letting it go meant agreeing with Dad that I didn't matter. This wasn't just about property. It never had been. It was about being seen, being valued, being acknowledged as someone whose voice mattered. And so I prepared. By the time the hearing date arrived, I walked into that courtroom with 4 binders weighing 12 pounds, combined 3 folders of supporting evidence, 27 highlighted statutes, and every ounce of discipline the Navy had ever instilled in me. Dad had no idea. Clay had no idea. Their attorney definitely had no idea. But I did, and that made all the difference. Because winning in court doesn't start in the courtroom. It starts in the quiet determination to fight for yourself when no one else will. And I finally was ready to fight. When people imagine courtrooms, they picture something dramatic, slamming gavels, shouting lawyers, a judge barking orders. Real American courtrooms aren't like that. They're quieter, more ordinary. They smell faintly of old carpet coffee and styrofoam cups, and the anxious sweat of people who wish they were anywhere else. But that morning my hearing felt anything but ordinary. It felt like every insecure moment of my childhood had followed me into the room and taken a seat in the gallery. Dad sat with his arms spread across the bench like he owned the place. Clay kept tugging at his tie, though he tried to hide how nervous he was. Their attorney, a tall, polished man with a silver tie clip, stood confidently at their table, whispering something to them while flashing that arrogant little grin people wear when they're sure the ending is already written. I sat alone at my table, my 4 binders neatly arranged in front of me. I didn't fidget, didn't look around. The Navy taught me how to sit still in high-stress situations. You can't brief commanding officers on operational threats while shaking like a leaf. You learn to control your breathing, control your tone, control every outward sign of fear. Inside, though, my stomach churned, my heart tapped against my ribs like someone knocking on a door. Still, I held steady. When the judge walked in, a man in his early 60s with reading glasses perched low on his nose, everyone rose. His expression was neutral, professional, restrained. This wasn't a TV show. He wasn't there to entertain. He was there to make sense of a mess. He took his seat. "This is case number," he began reading the file. "Parties will introduce themselves for the record." The opposing attorney stood. "Your Honor, Jonathan Huxley, representing Mr. Frank Dawson and Mr. Clayton Dawson." Dad puffed out his chest like being represented by Huxley was a badge of honor. Then it was my turn. I rose slowly. "Your Honor, Petty Officer First Class, soon to be promoted to Senior Chief Emma Dawson, representing myself." Dad laughed, out loud, not a chuckle, not a polite exhale, a full laugh, the kind that makes strangers turn around. "She's too poor to hire a lawyer." "Your Honor," he announced as if the courtroom needed the clarification, "we don't expect this to take long." There were snickers. Someone coughed to hide one. Even Huxley smirked, shaking his head like a teacher indulging a failing student. The judge didn't smile. He simply nodded for me to sit. And that was the moment something inside me hardened, not in anger, but in resolve. I wasn't here to impress Dad. I wasn't here to win his approval. I was here because Mom deserved someone to fight for her wishes. Huxley began with confidence, presenting his narrative like it was the only logical conclusion. "Your Honor, the Dawson men acted in good faith to manage a property that was neglected, under-maintained, and financially burdensome." I almost snorted. Neglected, under-maintained, I was the one sending money for repairs. He continued. "My client, Mr. Dawson, our elder, felt compelled to transfer the property to his son to ensure it remained in the family. No mention of their plan to sell it, no mention of Clay's debt, no mention of how they excluded me entirely. Typical, simplify, strategize, sanitize. Then came the moment he clearly thought would seal the deal. He lifted the deed transfer paperwork like it was a holy document. This transfer, he said proudly, was signed voluntarily by all relevant parties and is legally binding. He set it down with a theatrical flourish, confident he'd delivered a fatal blow. Dad smirked, nodding in satisfaction. The judge turned to me. "Ms. Dawson, do you wish to respond?" Wish to. I'd been preparing for this moment for months. I stood, opened my binder, and began. "Your Honor," I said, my voice steady, "the deed transfer is invalid under State Statute 42B subsection 3, which states that a handwritten will supersedes any unilateral property transfer conducted before probate is settled." Silence. Real silence. The kind that slides into a room like fog, soft but absolute. The laugh died on Dad's face. Clay blinked. Huxley's smile vanished like someone had turned off a switch. The judge leaned forward slightly, just enough for me to know he was listening. I continued, each word crisp. Furthermore, the acknowledgement signature presented by Mr. Dawson does not match the signature on file for earlier legal documents, including the 2014 property tax certification. There is measurable variance in slant pressure and letter formation. Huxley's jaw tightened. Dad looked like he'd swallowed a lemon. I wasn't done. Additionally, I said, flipping to a tabbed section, Mr. Clayton Dawson stands to directly benefit from the transfer, as evidenced by 3 debt collection notices filed against him in the past 18 months. These notices suggest financial motive. Clay's face flushed crimson. I kept going, not with aggression, not with theatrics, but with the same calm precision I used when briefing my CO. Each statement led to another, each document supported the last. Each inconsistency tightened the noose on their tidy narrative. And through it all, the courtroom stayed utterly silent. For the first time in my life, I had the room. Dad wasn't the loudest voice. Clay wasn't the center of attention. I was. And not because I begged for it, but because I earned it. Halfway through my presentation, Huxley tried to interject. "Your Honor, this is being taken out." "Let her finish," the judge said, raising a hand. Huxley fell silent. Dad stared straight ahead, stunned. Clay shifted uncomfortably, tugging at his collar. As I laid out the final document, a notarized statement from a neighbor who witnessed the rushed deed signing, the judge nodded slowly, thoughtfully. When I finished, he cleared his throat. "Thank you, Ms. Dawson. That was exceptionally organized." Dad's eyes widened. He looked at me like he was seeing a stranger. Or maybe seeing me clearly for the first time. Huxley began to sweat. He requested a recess. The judge allowed it. When the gavel tapped, Dad stood abruptly and stormed toward me. "What the hell was that?" he hissed. I met his glare with a calmness I didn't fully understand myself. "Preparation," I said. "Something you've never believed I was capable of." He opened his mouth to argue, then closed it. Nothing came out. Because for the first time in my life, he didn't have anything to say. And that was more powerful than winning any argument. Recess in a courtroom is a strange thing. The room empties out just long enough for nerves to reset, tempers to cool, and strategies to crumble or rebuild. For some people, it's a moment to breathe. For others, it's the moment the truth finally catches up with them. For Dad and Clay, it was the latter. As soon as we stepped into the hallway, Huxley pulled them aside. He tried to keep his voice low, but lawyers underestimate how acoustically unfriendly courthouse hallways are. Everything echoes, everything carries. And there was no mistaking the panic in his tone. "Why didn't you tell me about her background?" he demanded. What I said, stepping closer. Huxley looked at me, placed a hand on his hip, and exhaled sharply. "You're not a lawyer, but you present evidence like someone who's been doing this for years." "I read," I said simply, "and I prepare." Clay scoffed. "You think you're smarter than everyone now." "No," I said, "but I am smarter than you thought I was." Dad's eyes narrowed, but he didn't speak. His silence told me more than words ever could. When we returned to the courtroom, the atmosphere felt different, heavier, more cautious. Even the bailiff looked at me with a kind of quiet respect, the kind you give someone who has surprised you in a good way. The judge re-entered and everyone stood. As we sat down, he adjusted his glasses and addressed Huxley. "Counselor, do you wish to continue?" There was a long telling pause before Huxley replied, "Yes, Your Honor, but we reserve the right to challenge the document interpretations presented by Ms. Dawson." The judge nodded. "As is your right, proceed." Huxley stepped forward with visible effort, like his confidence had been replaced with sandbags tied to his ankles. "Your Honor," he began, "while the opposing party, Ms. Dawson, has presented detailed evidence, we maintain that the intent of the transfer was lawful and consensual. The father, Mr. Dawson, has every right." "No, he doesn't," I said. The judge glanced at me. "Ms. Dawson, you'll have your turn." I nodded. "Apologies, Your Honor." But my point hung in the air. Dad clenched his fists. Clay kicked the back of the bench in frustration. Huxley attempted to recover. As I was saying, he continued, "Mr. Dawson has acted in the best interest of his family." "Which family?" I asked quietly. This time the judge didn't admonish me. He looked at Huxley instead, silently asking him to continue in a way that actually addressed the facts. Huxley shifted papers. The father sought to prevent the property from falling into disrepair. "I sent over $6,000 in repair funds in 2 years, I said calmly. "I have bank statements." Gasps rippled through the gallery. Dad's head snapped toward me. "That money wasn't for repairs, it was for the roof, the heater, and the deck," I said, all of which were never fixed. The judge raised an eyebrow. Huxley closed his eyes briefly, as if asking whichever deity he believed in to intervene. But this wasn't about divine intervention anymore. This was about truth finally burning through decades of denial. The judge motioned for me to present my next set of documents. I stood, opened the second binder, and approached the bench. My hands were steady. My heart was not. But the Navy teaches you how to walk, even when your knees feel like they're made of water. "Your Honor, I said I'd like to present a notarized statement from Mrs. Collins, the neighbor who witnessed the deed transfer attempt." He read the document slowly, lips tightening. Huxley tried to object. "Your Honor, we haven't reviewed." "You will," the judge said, "in due time." Dad shifted in his seat. "She's twisting things. She's always been dramatic." I turned toward him. Mom wasn't dramatic when she wrote that will. That line, that single line, hit him harder than any argument I had made all day. He looked down, jaw trembling, not in rage, but in something deeper. Regret, maybe. Or fear. or the painful realization that he was about to lose a fight he believed he'd already won. Next came Clay's financial records, the ones he thought I didn't know about. His face went red as I laid out the debt notices, collection letters, and pending liens. I didn't do it to embarrass him. I didn't do it to hurt him. I did it because it mattered. Motive always matters. The courtroom murmured. Clay's fists clenched. Dad stared at him, stunned. "This is irrelevant," Clay snapped. "Everyone has debt." "Not everyone steals a house to pay it off," I replied. He lunged to stand, but Dad grabbed his arm. "Sit down," Dad muttered through clenched teeth. That moment, father restraining son glaring at father, was the first crack in their united front. The judge cleared his throat. "Ms. Dawson," he said, "I've reviewed your documentation. You've presented a more comprehensive evidentiary packet than some trained attorneys I've seen." A soft laugh went through the gallery, not mocking, amazed. I felt my throat tighten. Dad looked at the judge sharply. "So you're taking her side?" "I'm taking the side of the law, Mr. Dawson," the judge said firmly, "and your daughter understands it quite well." Dad said nothing. For once he truly had nothing to say. What came next wasn't dramatic, not in a Hollywood sense. It was quiet, procedural, methodical. But it was the moment the balance shifted. The judge examined the deed transfer again, reading every line with newfound scrutiny. Then he looked at Dad. "Mr. Dawson," he said, "this document is invalid." It felt like the oxygen left the room. Dad blinked. "Invalid. How can it be invalid?" Because the judge said calmly, "Your daughter is correct. The handwritten will supersede any attempt at transfer before probate is complete. Additionally, there are discrepancies in your signatures that warrant concern." Huxley looked like he wanted to sink through the floor. Dad swallowed. Hard. "I was just trying to help Clay." The judge nodded. Intent does not override statute. It was over for them. Not the whole case, not yet, but the turning point had arrived. Their narrative had collapsed. And mine, quiet, disciplined, underestimated for a lifetime, stood unshaken. As the judge prepared to move to the next phase of testimony, Dad looked at me not with anger, not with superiority, but with something I had never truly seen before. Fear, respect, and maybe the first hint of understanding. For the first time, he realized the truth. I wasn't the weak one. I wasn't the background character. I wasn't the child he could brush aside. I was the woman capable of dismantling a legal argument he thought was unbreakable. And he was only beginning to see what else I was capable of. The judge's words didn't end the hearing, but they ended the fantasy my father and brother had been living in. You could feel it, the way the atmosphere shifted, the way the gallery leaned forward instead of back, the way Huxley's polished confidence faded into something small and tired. For the first time all morning, Dad wasn't puffed up with pride or irritation. He just sat there, shoulders heavy, staring at the papers in front of him, as if they belonged to a stranger. But we still had to finish, and the finish was the part no one was ready for. "Ms. Dawson," the judge said, "do you have anything further to add before I issue a ruling on the preliminary matter?" I stood steady as a pier in a storm. "Yes, Your Honor, one final item." I lifted Mom's handwritten will, protected in a clear sleeve, edges slightly worn from the many times I'd held it while trying not to cry. "This was written during her last 6 months," I said quietly. "She wasn't dramatic, she wasn't impulsive, she was careful, intentional, and she wanted her children treated equally." My voice didn't crack. Not then. The Navy teaches you how to speak even when your heart is breaking. But Dad flinched like I'd struck him. I continued. "Whatever disagreements we had, whatever distance existed, she never wanted one child elevated above the other." I looked at the judge. "That's all I have." The judge nodded slowly, thoughtfully, then folded his hands. "Very well." The room went silent. Even the ventilation hum seemed to pause. "In the matter of Dawson versus Dawson," he began, "the court finds the deed transfer invalid. Furthermore, the court recognizes the handwritten will as controlling. Until probate is finalized, no party may sell, transfer, or alter the property. Both heirs retain equal legal standing." Clay sucked in a sharp breath. "You can't be serious." "Mr. Dawson," the judge said sharply, "sit down." Clay sat, but not quietly. His foot tapped violently like he was trying to kick the floor out from under us all. Dad didn't make a sound. He looked hollow, shrunk, like someone had pulled the air out of him. The judge wasn't finished. He removed his glasses. I will also be issuing an order for a handwriting comparison for Mr. Dawson's signatures, as there are legitimate questions regarding authenticity. Additionally, I am concerned by the financial motivations presented. Clay muttered something under his breath. Dad shot him a look, anger mixed with something else. Shame. And the judge added, I want to commend Ms. Dawson on the clarity and organization of her presentation. A low ripple of admiration passed through the courtroom. It wasn't applause, but it was close. Dad closed his eyes. I had spent my whole life waiting for him to look proud, and now he just looked lost. When the gavel finally came down, signaling the court's recess before final documentation, Clay nearly exploded out of his chair. This is ridiculous, he hissed at me. You think you're some kind of hero? You think you know everything? You ruined everything, Emma? I exposed everything, I corrected softly. Same thing. It shouldn't be, I said. If the truth ruins your plan, it wasn't a good plan. Huxley tried to calm him. Clayton, please. No, this is all her fault. He jabbed a finger at me. You don't even live here. You don't care about this family. I sent money, I said. I checked on Dad. I visited when I could. That doesn't count, Clay snapped. Dad finally spoke, voice low. Clay, stop. Clay froze. He turned eyes wide. Dad? Dad swallowed hard. His voice shook. She didn't deserve that. Those were words I had never heard from him, not once. Clay backed up a step, stunned. Dad, you're taking her side. I'm taking the side that's right, Dad said quietly, for once. Clay turned away, face red, jaw tight, fists trembling. He looked like a child realizing the world didn't bend for him anymore. When they left the courtroom, I stayed behind. I gathered my binders, tucked Mom's will back into its sleeve, and exhaled for what felt like the first time all day. My hands finally shook only a little, but enough to remind me I was still human. The bailiff approached. Ma'am, he said gently, you did good today. I nodded. Thank you. Outside the courtroom, Dad stood alone. Clay had stormed off somewhere, probably to throw a fit outside. Huxley was on the phone already trying to figure out how to salvage a case that couldn't be salvaged. Dad looked up as I stepped out. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Emma, he began, voice thin. I didn't know you had all that in you. I didn't respond. I wasn't ready to soothe him. He took a shaky breath. Your mother, she always said you were the strong one. I didn't listen. I should have. Hearing him say that didn't feel triumphant. It didn't feel like victory. It felt sad. Like we were standing in the ruins of a bridge we both should have built years ago. I never wanted to fight you, I said quietly. I wanted you to see me. He nodded, eyes damp. I see you now. It hurt more than I expected. We walked outside together, not speaking. The courthouse steps were bathed in late afternoon sun. People passed us without knowing the decades of history hanging between us. Emma, Dad said softly, I messed up. Badly. I thought you didn't need anything from me. You always seemed so strong. Being strong doesn't mean not needing your father, I said. He looked at me like I'd spoken a language he'd forgotten. I don't know how to fix all this, he murmured. Start by not letting Clay run your life, I replied, and stop letting him ruin his. Dad nodded, defeated. We stood there quietly for a long moment before he whispered, I am proud of you. That sentence, 6 small words, hit me harder than any verdict. I'd waited 33 years to hear them, and they arrived on the courthouse steps after a battle I never should have had to fight. But they mattered. More than I wanted to admit, more than I could hide. Dad left with slow, uncertain steps. I watched him go, knowing this wasn't the end of the story. Not for me, not for Clay, not for our family. But the tide had turned. The truth had won. And for once, I wasn't the daughter he dismissed. I was the one who stood up, spoke a single sentence, and froze a courtroom. In the weeks that followed, the hearing life didn't suddenly become perfect. Court cases never end in a single dramatic blow the way movies make it seem. There were still documents to file, calls to make, decisions to finalize. The estate attorney assigned by the court reached out to both me and Dad. Clay refused to answer emails at first, then sent a string of unhelpful, angry messages that only made the process slower. Still, something fundamental had changed. A shift I could feel every time Dad spoke to me, every time he hesitated before responding, every time he asked, not demanded, my opinion. For the first time in my adult life, he treated me not as the other kid, the background daughter, the reliable workhorse he didn't bother seeing, but as an equal. Maybe even as a person he respected. A month after the hearing, I drove home on a quiet Sunday morning. Winter had begun to settle in the kind of Midwestern cold that creeps under your collar and finds your bones. Dad had asked me to come over, and though part of me worried it would be awkward, I went anyway. His house looked smaller than I remembered. Different. Grief can change the shape of things even long after someone passes. I walked up the path, noticing a broken porch board I had offered to pay for 2 years earlier. Dad opened the door before I reached it. He looked older. Not weaker, but softer. The fight had drained from his eyes, replaced by something gentle and unfamiliar. "Emma," he said, stepping aside, "come on in." The warmth from inside felt strange at first. The house always used to smell like aftershave and cigarette smoke. Now it smelled like coffee and something baking. "Your favorite," Dad said awkwardly. "Blueberry muffins?" "Mom used to bake those." I swallowed the lump in my throat. We sat at the kitchen table, me with a mug of coffee, Dad with his hands folded like he was preparing for confession. "I talked to Clay," he said finally. "How'd that go?" "Not well," he admitted. "He's angry, feels betrayed." I took a slow breath. He needs help, Dad. Not another bailout, not another pat on the back. Real help. Dad nodded, staring into his coffee. "I know. I didn't want to admit it, but I know." For a long moment we just sat there, two stubborn Dawsons trying to speak the same language after years of miscommunication. Then Dad said something that surprised me. "I'm going to counseling." I blinked. "You, what?" He chuckled weakly. "Judge recommended it. Said family conflict like ours doesn't start in a courtroom, starts in a living room. Figured maybe he's right." I didn't trust my voice, so I said nothing. Dad exhaled shakily. "I want to be better. For you, for Clay, for your mother's memory." My throat tightened. I'd spent years wishing for a version of Dad who could say something, anything like that. Hearing it now felt like someone handing me a gift I didn't know how to unwrap. "Thank you," I finally whispered. He nodded, eyes shining. "I'm sorry, Emma, for all of it. I didn't see you. I didn't try. I thought strength meant not needing anything from anyone. Turns out, it just made me blind." My chest ached, but somehow the ache felt like healing. After we finished talking, I drove to Mom's house, the house that had sparked everything. Snow dusted the yard. The widow's peak above the porch sagged slightly, but the place still held warmth. Still held her memory. I walked room to room quietly, reverently. The living room still had the built-in bookshelf Dad swore he'd fix for 10 years. The kitchen window still had the little bluebird sticker Mom loved. The hallway still creaked in the middle, the exact spot Clay and I used to jump over as kids. It wasn't just a house. It was a story. Our story. And I finally felt like I belonged in it. I stood by the old wooden banister and took a slow breath. "I did it, Mom," I whispered. "I really did." It didn't bring her back. But it brought something back inside me, something strong, steady, and whole. Probate finalized after 2 more hearings. The house was officially declared jointly inherited exactly as Mom intended. Clay refused to show up to the last hearing, but he eventually sent a single text. "Fine, whatever, you win." I didn't respond. Not out of spite, just out of understanding. Winning wasn't the point. Being seen was. And Dad saw me now. 3 months later, on an early spring afternoon, Dad and I stood together in the driveway of Mom's house. He held a paint scraper. I held a bucket of primer. "Never thought I'd be out here doing manual labor," he grumbled. "You promised Mom you'd fix the place," I reminded him. He smirked. "Yeah, well, your mother always said you'd be the one dragging me back to my promises." I laughed softly. Guess she knew us. Dad worked beside me slower than he used to, but more patiently than I'd ever seen. We talked about small things, the weather, the neighbors' Navy stories he'd never asked about. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't easy. But it was real. And that was enough. When we finished for the day, Dad leaned against the porch rail and looked at me with pride that didn't come from obligation or comparison. You're a good daughter, Emma. I smiled. Took you long enough to figure that out. He chuckled. Yeah, it did. And just like that, the past didn't disappear. But it softened. It stopped being a wound and became a scar, something that hurt but no longer bled. Sometimes justice isn't about punishment. Sometimes revenge isn't about destruction. Sometimes the greatest victory is simply reclaiming who you are and giving someone else the chance to see it. To anyone listening, if you've ever been underestimated, ignored, or dismissed, let this be your reminder. Preparation matters. Your voice matters. Your story matters. And reconciliation, when approached with honesty and courage, is possible. Thank you for listening to mine. If this story meant something to you, I invite you to share it, reflect on it, or subscribe for more stories about strength, family, and hope.